I'm Bonnie Glazer, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. Today's episode is the second in a three-part series that examines the potential consequences for China if a military operation against Taiwan were to fail. In each of these episodes, we're speaking with authors of a recently published German Marshall Fund study of the possible costs that China would incur across four different but interrelated areas: the Chinese economy, its military, Chinese social stability, and the international costs that it might face. Our podcast today focuses on the potential costs for domestic social stability. To recap, the study, titled If China Attacks Taiwan, considered two imaginable scenarios taking place in the next 5 years. In the first scenario, a minor skirmish escalated into a multi-week maritime blockade of Taiwan by China. Although several dozen members of the Chinese and Taiwanese military were killed, U.S. intervention in this scenario eventually forced China to de-escalate. In the second scenario, a conflict escalated into a full-fledged invasion, with Chinese strikes on not only Taiwan, but also U.S. forces in Japan and Guam. After several months of heavy fighting, Chinese forces were degraded and eventually withdrew after suffering many tens of thousands of casualties. My guests today are Sheena Chestnut Greitens and Jake Rinaldi. Sheena is an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin and visiting research faculty at the U.S. Army War College. Jake is an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation. So welcome to both on the China Global Podcast.
Thanks, Bonnie. Great to be on with you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thank you for having us.
So let's start with the first question, big picture question for you. Why is it important for U.S. and allied policymakers to understand how domestic stability might factor into Chinese leadership thinking?
Sure. I think this should matter to U.S. allied partner policymakers for two primary reasons. First, at the macro political level, domestic stability really does lie at the heart of the CCP's political priorities, right? In an authoritarian political context. So in these sorts of systems, leadership succession broadly happens in two or three ways. You have some sort of institutionalized, negotiated retirement, which Xi Jinping has kind of thrown to the wind in recent years. You could have an elite coup or a violent revolution, right? And so at that point, when the political military leaderships, when their lives are on the line, that risk is really built into the system and considered across domains and across policymaking issues. Second, for defense planners specifically, domestic stability has a direct impact on Chinese military thinking. Some PLA textbooks from their PME ecosystem, internal stability is treated as a prerequisite for strategic deployments, conducting major combat operations, as well as potential impetus for war termination. In the Chinese lexicon, they talk about chain reaction warfare, which is a huge strategic concern for them, which basically says that you don't want two external conflicts happening simultaneously, and you also don't want an external conflict happening while internal unrest is present, right? They think that could lead to major strategic dilemmas. So in other words, from Beijing's perspective, the domestic situation conditions how much risk the leadership is willing to accept. So for U.S. and allied planners, the key question really does become how changes in the domestic polity could push Chinese leaders towards escalation, towards restraint, or towards war termination. And so I think our framework and the way that we systematically analyze some of these issues can help policymakers think more about those linkages and how to make informed assessments about Chinese behavior under stress.
It's very difficult to investigate the internal societal stability in China. So can you explain what the sources are that you use to analyze how the Chinese party state might approach managing social stability during a conflict over Taiwan?
It's a great question. And actually, when Jake and I started discussing this project, one of our questions was, where are we going to be able to find information that will help us understand how the Chinese party state and the Chinese leadership think about the management of social stability in the event of a Taiwan contingency? And it turned out there was more there, frankly, than I initially expected. So one of the things that we do in this study, and one of the things that we focus on, is a set of emergency response plans that China has developed that are a relatively recent set of plans and processes that the party state has updated. That starts with the National Emergency Comprehensive Response Plan. I think I'm getting the acronym right, the way we wrote it in the paper. And a whole set of then local plans for emergency response. And those plans are pretty broad. They cover a lot of different kinds of potential emergencies. But in particular, they cover what the party and what the documents call social security emergencies. So emergencies that really jeopardize social stability. That includes what China watchers might commonly know as mass incidents, these major events that threaten domestic stability and the party's, especially local, grip on social control. And so it turns out that under this National Emergency Comprehensive Response Plan now have been nested a whole set of local emergency response plans that include a discussion about how to deal with these kinds of emergencies. And in some cases, some of the language that talks about events that could threaten national sovereignty or territorial integrity or China's other core interests really do appear to apply to a Taiwan contingency. I don't think that's all the emergency response plans are intended to cover, but it certainly seems like they are scoped to include a potential contingency or emergency over Taiwan. And we kind of put that together then with a lot of the other documents and information we have about China's overall approach that it's developed under Xi Jinping to manage domestic security and social stability. Information on the budget, on the Ministry of Public Security, which has the lead for these social security emergencies, and all the things we know about how China works on sort of baseline level to maintain domestic stability. And so we kind of took these emergency response plans that looked like they're scoped to include a Taiwan contingency, put those together with what we already know about China's internal security apparatus, and then sort of looked at, okay, in the conditions, in the scenarios that this project imagined, how do we think this set of relatively new actors would respond, and how would the system actually approach these problems? So that's basically where we started.
I want to get you to unpack this a little bit more. What are the insights that you gleaned about how the Chinese Communist Party conceptualizes potential sources of instability and the tools that it intends to use, not only to suppress such challenges, but also potentially to preempt them?
Sure. So I think one of the most striking insights from these documents at the start is that the CCP is essentially treating mass incidents, right? 群体性事件, protests, riots, large-scale collective action as national emergencies on par with natural disaster, a pandemic, right? And I don't think that framing is necessarily intuitive outside of an authoritarian system, but I think it tells you a lot about how seriously these risks are taken. A second major theme that runs throughout these emergency protocols is that there's a consistent emphasis on identifying and neutralizing unrest before it even starts, right? On preempting unrest. That includes censorship, which has been, other scholars like Gary King have documented extensively, but it also goes well beyond that, right? There are surveillance responsibilities that these documents lay out, the monitoring of online activity, assigning specific offices to track grievances, and then escalate reports up a predetermined chain of command on very tight timelines. If unrest does begin to coalesce, the guidance also becomes fairly tactical, right? So they talk about how personnel need to target organizers and perceived ringleaders, ensure a visible security presence on the ground, and move very quickly to quell potential horizontal spread. A third insight, finally, one that I think aligns very well with our analytical framework in the piece, is that instability is understood as driven by specific grievances, right? They consistently trace unrest back to a particular source, whether that's financial disputes, labor issues, local government corruption, and then responsibility for what officials are dealing with those instances of unrest are allocated based on those sources, right? So financial regulators need to be involved if there's some sort of financial dispute, party disciplinary organs if there's local government corruption. And so I think these documents provide a degree of granularity that we have not seen on the division of labor when social instability does take place.
So you write in the paper about some of the organizations and institutions that exist in China to deal with some of these potential challenges. Could you talk a little bit about the new organizations that have been created under Xi Jinping that could play important roles in social stability maintenance under crisis or conflict conditions?
Yeah, one of the most important organizations that we focused on in this paper, because of the fact that we ended up looking at these set of documents and plans around emergency response, is a relatively new ministry, the Ministry of Emergency Management, that the PRC created as part of a reorg in 2018. And as part of that ministry absorbed some of the emergency response, first responder functions of things like the Ministry of Public Security and the People's Armed Police, as well as some other government agencies. And so we really looked at the role of that ministry in this whole nationwide emergency response planning process. The other organization that we thought was interesting and relevant that we wanted to highlight, because it hasn't gotten much attention, also is something called the Central Social Work Department, which is a party organization that was created in 2023, so really pretty new, that works with grid managers and the local public security bureaus. But its job is really to identify people who are having life experiences, and that's really broadly defined. Could be divorce, could be financial trouble, could be, losing a job or employment issues, or it could be political dissatisfaction. But to identify those people and again, deal with them on a really preventive level before their dissatisfaction can kind of metastasize and create broader social issues. And that department seems like it will have an important role because of its sort of responsibility for frontline monitoring and how integrated it has become with ground level practices and systems like the grid management system. So then you kind of layer that in with this broader architecture of national security and internal security, surveillance, early warning and prevention that Xi Jinping has created. And we looked at how these newer organizations seem to fit into the broader architecture of social control and social stability. There's a national early warning system that these documents outline that's color coded according to the level of severity and impact of the potential emergency or the threat that the potential emergency poses. And it assigns division of responsibilities to different actors. So one of the really interesting things, Bonnie, to your question is, we focused on a couple of new actors, the Ministry of Emergency Management and the Central Social Work Department, because we felt like they hadn't gotten a lot of attention in China watching circles, and kind of put that together against the backdrop of this existing internal security architecture. But we really don't have a great sense for how all of these pieces are going to function together in practice in a crisis. This is a relatively untested new system. And so, we tried to outline what we know, but I do want to be clear for anybody listening that this is a system on paper that hasn't, we've seen some tests in COVID, but, even the Central Society Work Department didn't exist during the COVID lockdowns. And so, even what we've seen the Chinese system practice, now you're adding even more new organizations in. And so it may look very different in the event of an actual crisis. So we're trying to lay out the baseline, but I do want to be clear that some of this is on paper, and how it will actually function in practice is an important and a little bit harder to answer question.
Yeah, that's really an important caveat, but fascinating that these institutions exist. And Hopefully, we won't see a crisis that in which they are tested.
I don't think I want to know how they'll work in practice, to be honest, but
bound to happen sometime. So in the paper, you identify three potential sources of domestic instability: material shortages, political disillusionment, and then the third is direct harm to or displacement of civilian populations. So how might the intensity of each of these shape the party's response in the case of a Taiwan conflict?
Yes. So, as you know, our analytical framing really focuses on isolating potential sources of grievances and then assessing how the party state might respond at the scale and the intensity of a conflict changes. So, starting with material shortages, the effects really do vary across the spectrum of conflict. In the minor conflict scenario, for example, I think you could see some trade disruptions, right? It's harder to get into port in an active conflict zone. As that conflict intensifies, those pressures would likely grow, particularly if the international community decides on sanctions, right? If those start to come into play. At lower levels of conflict, however, the state does have a number of tools and instruments at its disposal that we've seen working in the past to deal with any sort of logistical challenges, right? China's strategic reserve system has demonstrated a degree of effectiveness in the past, not least of which during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also, there's been other supply shocks. I'm thinking of the swine flu outbreak, and the state's strategic reserve system released pork to stabilize pricing and commodities. So that's the material shortages aspect. Political disillusionment is very, very difficult to assess, right? The party state retains extensive control over traditional media, what they call new media, right? 新媒体, which is more that social media presence. And it's been relatively effective in shaping the narratives of specific kind of recent events, whether you're talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, right? That being said, none of us really expected that A4 white paper protests at the end of the COVID lockdown, right? And I think that serves as a really important reminder that public sentiment can shift in ways that are very difficult to predict. Finally, the displacement or harm to civilian populations is really only relevant in scenarios where fighting reaches the mainland, right? So here we draw on two broad analogies to come to some analytical conclusions. The first reference point is that the state may view internally displaced civilians through the lens similar how they view floating population, 流动人口, or migrant workers, right? A population that is severely restricted by the hukou system, treated poorly in many instances, but is dealt with effectively from the perspective of internal stability, right? But dealt with at a degree of skepticism and suspicion. Our second reference point is, China has a history for strong capacity of rapid construction for emergency houses after natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, and also during COVID, we all saw how quickly they built those field hospitals where they were needed, right? And so that gives us a sense for how capable the state is at managing displaced civilians across the spectrum of conflict. All that being said, the dictum that's repeated across the PLA and the China watching community more broadly is that China hasn't experienced a major war since 1979, right? And so while the party state has developed an extensive internal security apparatus, right, it is likely to face significant and unexpected strains in any of these scenarios, and it's untested, right?
Yes, excellent points. The internal propaganda system in China emphasizes, of course, the importance of reunifying Taiwan with the motherland. It seeks to galvanize support from the people, presumably including in the event that a decision is actually made to take Taiwan by force. The leadership wants to ensure that it has the support of the people. And I wonder if, based on your research, if you have a high level of confidence that the party state can accurately assess what public support is for unification, including how much suffering the public might be willing to endure in order to achieve that goal. And what is the possibility that the leadership would underestimate the public's tolerance for having to make sacrifices, especially in the event of a prolonged conflict with Taiwan that escalates to a conflict with the United States and even Japan?
That's a very difficult question for us to answer from the outside, but I think it's important to remember it also is a very difficult question for the regime to answer for itself. We know historically that information problems in non-democracies are really significant. And I actually think that you can read some of what the Ministry of State Security is doing in terms of its engagement via social media, Chinese social media, as trying to collect more information from the population to try to get at the level of public dissatisfaction or to identify certain threats in the population itself. So I think that this is really a hard question. We know that information management is a priority in the emergency response plans. You can read that pretty plainly. It's in the Ministry of Public Security's guidelines for how you handle mass incidents. So our expectation is really that system will kick into overdrive and that China will try to manage both how the population sees the rationale for the conflict, right? It's already laying the groundwork for who is to blame in the event of an eventual conflict over Taiwan. And if you even look at the exercises late last year, it's Taiwan separatists in the language that Beijing uses, pro-independence forces, and the actors that do external interference, the U.S. and other allies usually. And so, it's already seeking to manage the rationale for the conflict, but may also seek to manage the facts of what the public knows about the facts of the conflict, and how it views the outcome of the conflict in the event that the CCP does not perfectly achieve its goals, which is the scenario we were talking about in this paper. And so there's a really interesting double-edged sword, or a line that the CCP is going to have to walk between trying to mobilize the population in support of the effort to begin with. You might get a rally around the flag effect. You might get a bump in popular support that's genuine. That's happened in other countries. I wouldn't rule it out in the case of the PRC, especially with all the nationalist and patriotic education that has been devoted to Chinese, patriotism in general, and Taiwan as part of that narrative, more particularly. But then the CCP is also going to have to figure out how to leave itself enough room to de-escalate a conflict, whatever the outcome is, and to de-escalate in a way that doesn't leave the public thinking that it failed to stand up for China, and for China's goals and for China's image. And so that's a really hard line to walk. And if I was the CCP, I would be really nervous about whether my read on public opinion is accurately calibrated enough to be able to walk that line, because it's so difficult in the first place, even if you have great information. And I think we have to expect that their information will be imperfect.
You assert in the paper that, and I think this is quite accurate, that a limited conflict would create some localized stresses on stability, but that the system really has developed some capacity to absorb stresses. And if something is short-term, is limited impact, doesn't affect the mainland, their own territory, that probably then this wouldn't really rise to the level of posing a major threat to political stability or to overall internal stability. But of course, a protracted conflict would be very different. And I found it really interesting and useful that you introduced a third scenario of protracted conventional conflict, not only one that expands and is more prolonged, but specifically involves strikes or damage to the Chinese mainland, including to infrastructure and to military facilities. So talk a little bit about why you introduced that scenario and what you conclude about social stability risks that could be created, especially in that third scenario, and how the party might respond to them.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And one reason we included this scenario is that it is analytically very important, right? Even if it's not the most likely outcome, once a conflict reaches a certain scale and scope, it becomes increasingly difficult to assume that the Chinese mainland would remain entirely insulated, right? I think it's also very, very important to note that this scenario doesn't depend on assumptions about U.S. strategic decision-making, right? Taiwan has developed and procured capabilities that can range the mainland. And if Taiwan is facing a joint firepower strike, it's probably reasonable to assume those capabilities could be employed. And to the central motivation for our paper, right? Once the mainland is impacted, the social stability picture changes in several very important ways. Material stresses become much more acute. China relies heavily on a system of military-civil fusion, civilian logistics networks, its national mobilization plans. And so once you have damage to infrastructure or transportation nodes, whether it's ports, factories, specific to the internal security apparatus, people's armed police facilities, right? Those things would not only impact warfighting, but could also complicate the party state's ability to monitor and to manage unrest. On political disillusionment, I think that becomes a much more serious concern if there are strikes on the mainland, right? When conflict costs are felt directly by the population, the CCP may face a more challenging environment in terms of sustaining public confidence, right? Particularly if we're assuming that the CCP is already coping with the costs of a failed invasion. Population displacement also only becomes a potential factor in this scenario, right? Strikes on the mainland raise the prospect for internal displacement, harms to civilian, which introduces a host of other issues that we don't see at those lower levels of contingencies. So I think the real value of examining this scenario is to understand how an expanding scope and duration of a conflict can introduce qualitatively different challenges to the social, to the internal security system, right? And then analyze what tools and instruments the CCP has at its disposal to deal with them.
Sheena, I think it was you earlier who referred to the white paper movement at the end of the COVID lockdown period. So I think it's really interesting, at least to consider what lessons maybe the Chinese Communist Party learned from those COVID lockdowns and the white paper movement. And do you think that any of those lessons then could be applied in the event of a major conflict with the United States over Taiwan?
Yeah, I think that the COVID lockdowns are important because although they're not directly analogous to a conflict over Taiwan, especially one that's largely offshore, they do give us a sense of how the internal security apparatus and the apparatus designed to maintain social stability functions under the highest level of stress that I think we've arguably seen it experience on a nationwide level, right? We've had other social stability incidents that are region or even city, town specific, but COVID was different in the scale of the national stress and challenge. So I think the CCP learned a couple of things. First, that they can't 100% predict or prevent public backlash to some of the stresses we've been talking about, particularly mobilization and some combination of heightened lockdown social control. But second, that the system can tolerate local disruption, even if it happens multiple places at a time, as long as it can kind of keep those incidents isolated. And that's one of the things we talk about in the paper is the importance of understanding how decentralized China's apparatus for social stability actually is. And so therefore, even if there's damage to one part of the system and you take out sort of the command infrastructure at the PSB level, or it gets damaged in a conflict, the rest of the system, because it's so decentralized, has a pretty high ability to keep functioning. And so I think that's one of the observations that the white paper movement maybe illustrates from the COVID period. The third point is that China I think that the COVID experience helped China identify and maybe pointed them toward ways of solving some of the challenges that Jake was just going through. So especially, for example, on logistics and material shortages, right? Shanghai had material shortages during the lockdowns. The issue actually wasn't that the material wasn't somewhere in the country. It was getting it from point A to point B and getting it distributed with checkpoints and border internal control movement controls being put in place. And so I think it gave China a chance both to think about how those needs interact with each other, the control and the need to keep certain things moving, and to then think about new solutions. So we've seen, and we talk about in the paper, some of the experimentation with big data systems and analytic platforms that the CCP has used, that we've seen some cities and localities experiment with, to basically try to solve some of these blockages in the internal distribution of material. And I guess the way I think about that, just to connect it to things that listeners might have heard a little bit more about, Xi Jinping's comprehensive national security concept talks about food security, talks about energy security. And typically, when we hear that, when we think that, I think about sea lanes, right? And either pipelines as an alternative to shipping energy, or thinking about food security in terms of where does China get its food and how does it get to Chinese ports. But this is the internal sort of complement to that. It's okay, great. It's great if it makes it to China, but then you still have to get it to certain places internally. There's an internal distribution process that has to function for social stability to be maintained. And that's really a big part of national security. And so I think it's a part that prior to this I had underappreciated in terms of how these things like food and energy security have this emergency response sort of corollary, that we got a chance to look at and learn a little bit about. And I think the party learned things about that process from COVID as well, that we've seen them then sort of try new systems to say, okay, we learned from that. Let's see if this can fix this material distribution problem internally.
There's a point that you make in your paper, which also is made in the paper on the Chinese economy, which we will be talking about in the next podcast, that essentially even after a conflict ends, that there can be consequences that go on for some time well after the conflict has ended. If there's no military activity, nonetheless, there could be long-term implications, certainly for the Chinese economy, and you say possibly for stability. And you make a point that the work of the system, the party state in China, to maintain internal security and social stability would continue until well after the cross-strait conflict ends. So what are the challenges that could arise that need to be managed? And do you see any evidence that the Chinese also think about it this way, that a prolonged conflict and the work involved in preserving its stability would go on after that conflict ends?
I should be clear that when we think about this, we're doing some informed speculation exercises here. So just, some of what we've said so far has been pretty based on what we can read on, at least on paper, in these emergency response plans and how China thinks about and identifies these as key problems that it will need to solve. I think this is a little bit harder to predict because it is so far into a conflict. And as a conflict unfolds, you're going to meet with all sorts of unexpected developments. So just a caveat in terms of what I'm about to say. I think this is where that tension I was talking about before, about the need to mobilize support for conflict, support for warfighting, and the flexibility needed to de-escalate, really is going to be a point of stress for the CCP, because it's really hard to sort of rev people up to go to war and then back down. And even the phrase I just used, back down, right, is a charged term, and the Chinese leadership probably won't want to be seen as having backed down. So the question is, how is a campaign, a military campaign involving Taiwan, if it's not entirely successful, how do you frame that to the domestic population? And so I think for that reason, you can't just sort of say, oh, didn't work out. Okay, just kidding. Everybody back to normal, right? That's not a sort of the way that Taiwan and the discussion of Taiwan and unification and national rejuvenation has been embedded in now years and years of public discourse. So I think it's going to be a real challenge. That's why we don't think that mobilization around a conflict will dissipate right away. And so the security elements of that won't be backed off right away, because that de-escalation process is in some ways as politically sensitive from the standpoint of social stability, right, specifically, as the conflict itself. And so that's a process that politically for the CCP is going to be seen, in my view, as very high risk and needs to be very carefully managed and without a lot of room for error. And the thing about mobilizational systems is, again, they're really good at sort of pointing people in one direction and throwing tons of energy toward accomplishing a goal in incredibly short order, right? The field hospitals being a great example. They tend to be less sensitive to other external costs. And so the question is, is there a point at which the party state will decide that the costs of continued securitization around this de-escalation of external conflict, when are they going to feel comfortable letting up a little bit? And with COVID, it took a real, I think, unique combination of factors, getting through the sort of leadership transition that happened that fall, some public pushback. But so I think it's going to be a very complex calculation, and it's hard to foresee in advance how to meet those conditions. But that's the bar I think the CCP will feel like it has to meet is, okay, it's safe to let up a little bit now. And that's not an easy thing for any non-democracy to do, particularly in a situation like de-escalation, where the regime may feel that either the leaders or the broader regime's legitimacy and maybe even political survival are at stake.
Absolutely. Really important points. I'm so grateful to both of you for writing such a fantastic paper. And I hope that our viewers and our listeners will look into the paper, this one and the other ones, which comprise a report that the German Marshall Fund has released, which is called If China Attacks Taiwan. And you can find it on our website. We've been talking with Dr. Sheena Chestnut Greitens, who's an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and Dr. Jake Rinaldi, who's an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for a fantastic conversation.
It's a great project, Bonnie. It was a pleasure to be part of it. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.